So today we have John Morrison with us, or actually J.S. Morrison that he uses for his name for his writing. He has a great book called The Perfection of Fish. Now, actually, this is an old copy of the book. I believe that you changed the colors on the new book considerably.
Right.
But it's an interesting cover anyways. Any way you look at it, I think you have a white writing on it instead of the black, so that you can read the names of it considerably better. That's the way it looks on Amazon right now, though. Now, this will be available in July, I believe.
Right, the 9th of July.
9th of July. So, Mr. Morrison, this is his first book, but he's had quite a life to bring him up to this point. In fact, he and I share a couple of things. We both were in the Vietnam War, I want you to know. So I was there before you, so I prepared it for you so you didn't have so much to do when you got there, okay? I was
You got out in the nick of time.
I was there in 67, out after the Tet Offensive. So you got there at 70, I believe, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And we sort of share some other things too that I thought was interesting too, that we both lived in Columbia, Maryland for a while. I lived there after I got out of the service, which was about 72, as an active duty officer, and was in the reservists, and I chose to live up in Columbia, Maryland. It was just actually, at that particular time, it was just sort of being built. It was nowhere, the way it seemed to be, and they were just building all these new buildings, which were nice homes, really, and a good place to live if you were working in D.C.
My wife was a reservist.
Oh, she was a reservist too? Yeah.
We share that with you as well.
So, but you stayed in, which is very interesting, I think, doing 20 years or more.
Right. I was on the verge of getting out. And the Air Force made me an offer that I couldn't refuse, which was basically to send me back to school to become an engineer, and they would pay for it. So I took them up on it. That was the reason. And
but you had already done a lot of programming before that on your own. You taught yourself.
Right. Right. Yeah, I learned the hard way. Actually, I learned in school as both an undergraduate and a graduate student. We had this new thing in our school. It was called or it was actually in the biomedical computer laboratory at Washington University. And it was called a mini computer, but it took up 5 racks of equipment.
Right.
And the way you had to program it was you flip the switch up and that would become a 1, and you flip it down and that would be a 0.
Yeah.
And it was all machine language. There was no high order language. But anyway, that's how I learned.
But then you moved forward with the programming after that. It's interesting though, because I think many programmers have actually, because when you program, you have to be so diligent about what you're doing, and you have to really think it out, not only as the next step, but at many, many steps down the road. And so it's sort of, there's a parallel between that and writing, I think. I think like when you wrote this book.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. You've got a beginning, a middle, and an end.
Yeah, you do. But that programming to me is much more difficult than writing a book, because if you make a mistake in programming, the program won't work. Someplace in it, it won't work, or do whatever you wanted correctly. But in a book, you can make mistakes, and people, if they really love the book, they're going to gloss over it, not even notice it, most likely.
So did you find my mistakes?
There's probably a mistake or two in there, but that's everybody. Patterson has them, Stephen King has them, everyone has them. But I thought it was interesting that you picked the Appalachian area to write about in a year 2042, and why?
Well, what I really wanted to get at in the book was how imagination and delusion are related to what it means to be human. and I wanted to be almost a fairy tale. And of course, if you look at the book, it is kind of a fairy tale. It
Yeah,
starts out once upon a time,
sure.
um, and at the very end, it's it says the end. So it's classic fairy tale kind of format. But I picked Appalachia because having lived in North Carolina for a few years, it seemed to me that that was a really interesting place. I mean, on the one hand, you have the high technology of uh, the Triangle area um, in North Carolina, and on the other hand, you have sort of this area of Appalachia where you can go into the backwoods, you can find people who still believe in spirits and demons and those kinds of things. And so I wanted to bring those ideas together. Um, that's why I knew a little bit about North Carolina, and I'd been to that area, and I was interested, and I thought that would be a good setting for these themes.
I think it was too. And the fact that it was supposed to be pretty much a deserted area, a deserted town. And of course, we all still think the Appalachian, most of us, as this place where people are still playing music like this. Here, let me just put this in the background here for a minute, which I think is, if it plays. I mean, that's the kind of music that I think of when I think of the Appalachian area. And by the way, this is a great guitar player too, this Lucy Blackman. Plays all kinds of crazy guitars, but but anyways, let's move back to you.
I like it.
One second here. Anyways, going back to your book, where they're doing all of these trials on artificial intelligence. I thought that's another interesting thing that's really going on right now. So, and you sort of pushing this into the future. So where are you mentally with that right now? Where do you think artificial intelligence is going to go in the next 22 years or 24 years?
Well, it probably won't go to the point where that I've described in the book. But
you said that you don't think it will move to the extent where you talked about how you talked about it in your book. However, right now, I know that they're actually experimenting with ways of implanting devices in brains, according to Mr. Musk, Elon Musk. Have you read about that at all?
yes, I have.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's going to be some time. I mean, there's an interesting book by Neil Stephenson where he explores where that could go. But I think it's going to be some time before AI gets to the level that I've talked about in this book. I've got another book that I'm working on right now that also explores AI a little bit. But the main thing about the modern approach to AI is that it's no longer a machine that is coded the way you learn to code or the way I learn to code.
Right.
It's in fact something that is trained. It's basically a certain configuration of a network.
It's trying to mimic the way we learn.
Yes, exactly. So that's really the kind of thing that has to happen. It has, and the training part of it needs to be worked on considerably. I think in my book, I describe how you could accelerate the training through some sort of a quantum
computing. Yeah.
system. But it's sort of hard to look into the future when to a time when the machines are equivalent to humans. But when I think about that, I also think about kind of the Spider-Man warning, which is with great power comes great responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
You can create something that is very human-like. You have a lot of responsibility on how that thing is configured. And also, there's kind of a line from Pirates of the Caribbean. Captain Jack Sparrow is teaching Will Turner to sword fight, and he says, "Remember, whatever a man can do, a man will do." So that's what you have to remember about this technology as well. You know, it's technology may be invented for one purpose, but whatever a man can do, a man will do. And so that's the downside. What I wanted to do was get a little bit into the downside of genetics in this book.
Right. And I did like the whole idea that you're talking about changing the way we think so that we no longer want to kill and that we no longer want to do these, to be aggressive as we have been in the past as men. I thought that was an interesting piece that you stuck in there.
Right. Well, you know, that's not an original idea, but if you look at the statistics of who kills and who gets killed, it's mainly males. There was an interesting article that I read a while back about sort of a funnel point or a choke point in the DNA of humans, where it looks as though maybe about 80% of males had been removed from the equation, and the speculation was, well, that was probably due to tribal warfare that almost killed most of the males. So that was another thing that I wanted to sort of bring out in the book.
So what is when you're the fish eye and the references to the fish in the book? Why don't you talk about that a little bit, if you would? You got a talking fish.
The fish was actually one of the original things that I put in a file saying, where I said, I must write a book about this. There's a fish story that goes back to 2000. I think it's like 2003. There was an article in the New York Times, and it was carried by the Wall Street Journal, and picked up by some overseas newspapers about a fishmonger in Brooklyn that was about to kill a fish, and it started speaking to him in Yiddish, telling him about the end of the world. And so this story got picked up and spread all over. And it's one of the things I put in my file saying, I must write this into a novel at some time. But the fish really represents sort of the wild side, the unknown side, the frontier side, if you will, almost. It's the part of the equation that you never imagined was there. The idea that this computer that's trying to figure out in the complexity of the human DNA, what is it that orchestrates behavior? And the computer decides on what it wants to do to move human evolution. And it has to do with fish. It's not
Yeah.
um, simply because that's what it knows about. Um, so that's the fish tie, I guess.
And as far as human evolution, uh, your book actually talks about what we're going to be in 24 years, uh, which I said before is one of those kinds of things very hard for a person to predict because things change so rapidly, and sometimes something will happen, like the cell phone, that all of a sudden changes the world immensely, or the internet. I think the internet did, but the cell phones have definitely. I mean, like when you're talking about your mini computers, I actually worked with Nike Missile way back in '64, and Nike Missiles had this huge computers in a trailer where we just had the chassis, we pulled them out, put them in, and we did the same thing, basically threw the switch up or changed the potentiometer just a little bit to make sure it's working correctly. And that was a computer, it just basically multiplied, added, subtracted, did division, did a few other kinds of calculations. And now though, that's all on a cell phone. I can tune my computer, excuse me, my guitar with that. I can watch a video with it. It's a whole world. In fact, it's sort of like, it's become a part of us. I mean, if you don't have your cell phone in your hand or nearby, you feel like something's missing.
Right. So let's pull that thread. What you have now is a cell phone. You don't have to know about zeros and ones, about flipping a paddle switch up or down to program a machine. You don't have to know how the machine thinks. It is so simple. It is basically a lot of point and click. And so suppose you had a framework that allows you to point and click, and in those points and clicks, you are changing the human genome. I mean, that to me is scary.
Oh,
But
yes.
But it's the kind of thing that is a logical progression of what we have now with CRISPR technology and so forth.
But they're doing that right now, actually.
Yes,
So
but it's not quite that. It's not quite that easy.
oh, absolutely, yeah. But even that has only been in the last 10 years. I mean, when was that supposedly completed, having a total, what do you want to call it, encyclopedia of what each piece was supposed to represent?
Right, the Human Genome Program.
Yeah.
Right, it started out. It was supposed to be a 10-year sort of program, but then people started looking at the problem in a much different way. You don't need to do that kind of painstaking sequence. Suppose you could break everything apart. And then, of course, came the idea of CRISPR, which is actually something that bacteria do to defend themselves against viruses. They basically re-engineer the virus. It was that technology that became CRISPR and allowed them to essentially fragment the genome, pull it apart, recombine it, and very quickly determine the actual end-to-end sequence. So technology has changed.
Yes.
Rapidly and extensively, yeah.
But on the when we go back, just talking about the cell phone, I feel like that kind of technology. One of the things that back when we had the huge computers, other people didn't do anything with them. It was just people like you and I who messed with them. That was it. They performed a function, and we were the ones who had to understand how they worked and to make them work. But now a cell phone or TV or anything, the majority of the people have no idea how it really works. They just know that they can do something with it. And I think that makes a huge difference because all of a sudden there's this tremendous amount of power that people who really know how to program have over the entire 8 billion people that are out there ready to use their products. um, that don't have the slightest idea how it really works, other than it does something that they want it to do. And going back to your book, I mean, basically, once some of these things happen, people would just accept it. It's just because we're an accepting population. Whenever things are given to us and they seem, that looks okay, we don't really question it much. We just do it.
Right. And so economics will drive down the cost of doing it. It will be tremendously simplified, which means that anyone eventually will be able to get in and change what it means to be human, change the genome itself. And I think that's a really scary thing. There was a book written by Marvin Minsky. I think it was around 2006, and he talked about the implications for machines of what happens if you allow a machine to modify itself. And he concludes that it's not a good idea, because if you give a machine the ability to modify itself, it could destroy itself quite easily. And but then he also talks about emotion as being a way to do sort of self-modification of behavior instantly in order to adapt to some situation. So there's a lot to unpack there about the future and genetics.
Is your next book also going to be a futuristic type of story? Is it scientific?
It will be speculative fiction. It's the tentative title is The Pieces of Myself, and it takes place like 100 years in the future. It's not about genetics, but it is about it does have some things in it about AI, and it is set in the South. And I think that's all I want to say about it at this time.
Okay. Well, let's talk a little more about this. First thing, I want to make sure everybody, again, sees this book. Do you have a copy of the latest one by any chance near you? Where you can...
No, I don't. I have the same one you do.
You have the same one. Okay.
Readers.
I noticed the publisher now has a different cover.
Right. This was the prototype cover. It came on the advanced reader's copy, and which I sent to you.
Yes, yes. So so it comes out on July 9th, you said.
Yes, the 9th of July.
And actually, the company that has published it, I like them a lot, by the way. I think they do a great job. Have you made any plans on speaking or anything of this nature, talking about your book in any places? Of course, now with this COVID-19, it makes it rather difficult to get out there and do what we need to do as authors.
Right. That's why an interview like this over Zoom is so valuable.
Yeah, yeah. I hope it will be. I really hope it will be. Do you work every day on writing right now, or is it just, again, something that you're sort of still moving into slowly?
I've done most of my research now for this next book, and I've written a few chapters, and I'm about, I would say, halfway through with the outline. Once I get a complete outline, then it will take me, I'm guessing, probably anywhere from 15 to 18 months to get a version of it that's good enough, I think, to send to the publisher.
Incidentally, going back to a million years ago when you were in Vietnam, where were you stationed in Vietnam?
I was in Karat, Thailand.
Okay, you were in Thailand. Okay.
And my wife to be was stationed in Udon Thani, Thailand, which is to the north, and that's where we were married. It was in Thailand.
Really, really.
Yes.
I was going to say that on writing, your experience back in that time might be another subject that you may find uh, you find a huge audience for it. I've written a book about my experience there, which became pretty successful, and I think that there's a lot of us who are reading those books about what went on during that time. It's just not the war, but just the people, everything about it, the music, everything that was so different than now.
Right. I guess my preference is not the past, but to look at the future.
You certainly are.
That's,
You're looking at the future.
I mean, when I was in grade school, I kept a scrapbook on the future,
Right.
and it told me what it was going to be like. We were going to have flying cars, and there were going to be these little atomic pills that you can put in gas tanks, and your car would run forever. And that was the future. You know, I had a whole book that told me what the future was going to be, and it didn't turn out like that at all. The future was never what I imagined.
But the future is going to be very interesting as far as a lot of things like cars. I think will actually, more of them will be uh, automated to the point where we sit in the back seat dozing while it drives for us in many, many places. I think that will become a big deal in another 20 something years. I think many of the things you predict in your book will absolutely, if not exactly what you talk about them, but much more of it will be real in 24 years from now. I
Right.
mean,
But whatever happens with technology, the thing that sort of doesn't change or won't change unless it's a genetic kind of change is human nature. You know, you can change the underlying technology, but it's hard to change the underlying meaning of what it is to be human, unless you can change the genome itself.
but a lot of the reasons why we do what we do as humans is because of trying to become, trying to survive, period. I mean, we look at ourselves, wow, we're really a very modern society now. But of course, if we look at ourselves 100 years from now, we're going to look at ourselves as we do people back in the 1800s or the early 1900s, that we don't see them as all that modern with their little low Model T Fords and things of this nature. They're going to look at our cars and say, a piece of junk, or well, how did they exist? Or even our cell phones. I don't even think there'll be cell phones. I think it will be some implants in our heads or on our arms or something that we'll be using instead of trying to remember where that damn cell phone is. Where is that cell phone? I need my cell phone. I lost it somewhere. I think all those things are so crucial to our well-being now that they're going to advance further. I mean, even Apple, had their little watch. I don't think it's gone that well selling that watch. It's supposed to be a phone and everything else. But I do think that the things that Musk talked about, where you might have implants that will actually you will be able to access information on Google or whatever automatically, that will truly happen. Those who will be able to afford those kinds of implants that he claims will not harm you at all. In fact, he's saying that this could happen within a couple of years. Of course, it'd probably be 10 years, but nonetheless, I like him a lot, by the way, Elon Musk. I think he's.
I'm still waiting for my flying cars.
Did he predict that?
No, but I have it in my scrapbook. Back from.
They have had a few flying cars. I mean, people have made a few, but I think there's so many laws that are stuck in there that you can't. That's the problem of those things. Trying to get them out on the road, trying not to hit a telephone pole with your wings and all those kind of things. But I do believe they've actually created some that could not be truly used anywhere. We certainly had the cars that could be you can use in the water, you can use on the road, and et cetera, et cetera. So, but again, we have just become so dependent on some of this technology. People are just so dependent on it and not in a good way either. So that's the other thing. But they accept it and they use it. And they find it that they really think this is the way to go. So I think a lot of the things in your book will become close to being a reality in 24 years. So how much is your book? How much? Oh, are you going to have? I know that right now there's just a book version.
Both the Kindle version and the softcover version come out at the same time on the 9th of
Oh,
July.
okay. Yeah. And we did link up on our website on authorsreading.com. We did in fact link a copy of things from your website, some first 10 pages or so, a couple of chapters that you had out there, so people could in fact read the first few chapters and start getting into it. I hope it'll be a great success. I hope you can get up there and talk to people and get them interested in the book. I really think it's a very cool book. I love books. In fact, some of the writers you liked, I did too. I noticed you didn't have Asimov in there, but I did like him too back then.
I was reading Asimov, but I wouldn't necessarily cite him as a person who has influenced my writing.
Yeah. But it's a very interesting book that you've written. I think that a lot of the people right now are reading these kind of books that actually talk about the future. So I think this will be, and the whole idea that to me, that you chose this area to use as the place where all this happens is again odd but interesting that you used the Appalachian area, because I always think the Appalachian area is this desolate place that people living in shacks and everything. Of course, that's not true anymore, but nonetheless,
there's some very expensive houses now.
Oh, absolutely. And the college there, Appalachian College, is beautiful. I don't know if you've seen that. It's a beautiful place. Just like Texas, by the way, everyone thinks Texas is this place where there's tumbleweeds and there's no grass, and we all have horses and everything, and but we don't. And when I first got here from California, I came in from California actually, and got the plane. My son was actually stationed up at Fort Hood, Texas, so I was coming in and wanted to go see him. But I stepped off the plane, it was just so hot. It was like a blast furnace hit me in the face, which probably was like that. And when you went to Saudi Arabia, I mean, it was just so damn hot, and it was just interesting. And but it was green, and I ended up living in Austin for a while. Then I moved over to Lumberton, Texas, and I moved here because of technology. I mean, I actually was teaching software programming, so and writing programs myself. So that's how I got in this area, and that's why I'm so interested in books like what you would write, because of the technology aspect of it and the fact that you're trying to predict what's going to happen into the future, and based on what's going on right now. So there's so many things that can upset it with somebody like Musk doing something that moves everything forward much quicker than you would anticipate, so that by the time 2042 comes around, what you had predicted happened 10 years before. It's just interesting. I just think that it's really a gamble when you're writing these kind of books to try to figure out what could be.
Right. Well, that's why I sort of couched it as a fairy tale, sort of a modern fairy tale, because that gives me some leeway, if you will.
Right.
I can talk about the themes, but I don't have to be that spot on with respect to the technology.
So what kind of people do you think, who are your target market? I hate using that word. That would be the kind of people who would really love reading this book as far as you're concerned.
I would say if people enjoy Fargo,
Oh, yes.
They would probably like this book. Um, and just because the the movie and the TV series Fargo had quirky characters, it had a quirky plot, and there's a tension in Fargo between sort of the wild frontier and civilization. And Noah Hawley, who wrote the screenplays for Fargo, brings out some of those things in his book, which is called Fargo. Um, I think if people enjoy the video series Killing Eve, they might like this, because that's kind of a dark tale with very quirky characters and a very quirky plot. If you like Kurt Vonnegut, you know, and his visions of how the world could end,
Right.
you know, this would be in keeping with that. Um, even even Hitchhiker's Guide, just for its craziness,
Yeah.
and you know, people who like that might be interested in this.
Okay. Well, we're going to have to, unfortunately, cut this very soon here. So is there anything that you want to talk to the audience about that we have not yet covered?
No, I don't think so.
Well, you need to tell them you want them to read this book and
Oh,
at least 1 million people. In fact, everybody out there that sees this needs to buy this book, period. This man.
David, there is one more thing I would like to say to the readers. On my website, if you look at one of the tabs, you will see a curriculum that I put together. One of the things I'm doing is teaching one of my granddaughters, who's in the 3rd grade, how to write. She wants to become a writer, and so I am using the Harry Potter book. I'm sorry?
I said she has a good teacher so far.
Well, we'll see, but I'm using the Harry Potter books because she's very interested in Harry Potter, and I'm using it as a way to teach her how to write.
Right.
So I put some of the lesson plans on my site if anybody is interested.
Okay. Could you give the name of your site again? The URL. The URL.
Vorpalword.com.
It's VOPEL.
Comma or HTTPS : Vorpalword VORPEL WORD.com. Vorpalword.com. And so if you go to one of the tabs, you'll see how I'm trying to teach my 3rd grade granddaughter how to write novels.
Great. We need new writers. So anyways, I want to thank you, John, for being with us.